Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. In 2021, we broadcasted an episode which featured Saul and a guest, Chanel Brown. The title of that episode was About Me Being Racist, a conversation that follows an apology. We actually rebroadcast that episode last month, and we're revisiting the questions raised in that episode. The question I have for Saul is why? Hi, Saul.
Hey, Stefan. So there are a couple reasons I wanted to take a bit of a journey back to that episode. The first is that we've actually recently been covering the topic in a number of discussions we've had with guests around the way in which racist ideas affect clinical practice. And partly as a result of our discussions and just things that have been of interest to me, I've just been doing a lot of reading and reflection. The incident with Chanel, for our listeners who haven't heard it, goes back to about 2002 when I was a young attending. And I was actually a program director. I was a director of the medicine pediatrics residency program on my institution. And Chanel was a coordinator. She was the coordinator for the MedPeds program. So she was subordinate to me. And it had to do with me asking her to dress differently. And this was precipitated by somebody who had been my superior, who had asked me to, quote, deal with this situation and felt that Chanel wasn't dressing appropriately. She was responsible for giving tours to medical students who are applying to the program. And as I made very clear in the episode, and again, Chanel participated in that discussion that we recorded, she was dressing absolutely fine. But I had been co-opted by a system that had notions about how Black women should dress. And I made it very clear I took full responsibility for that. But Chanel also talked about the profound way in which it affected her for 20 years. She really couldn't dress in a way that was consistent with who she is. And that affected her psychologically. And it reminded me of something that I had read from the author, James Baldwin, writing from the perspective of sort of a generic white person. Baldwin says, quote, "Black man, to become fully human and acceptable, must first become like us. This assumption, once accepted, the Negro in America can only acquiesce in the obliteration of his own personality, the distortion and debasement of his own experience, surrendering to those forces which reduce the person to anonymity, and which make themselves manifest daily all over the darkening world."
Let me ask you if we're applying this to the story with Chanel. That is, the way I hear you saying it, James Baldwin, writing probably in the 1960s, describes this generic white view in which a Black person is supposed to take on all the forms, behaviors, and motifs of a white person. And you're looking back at your behavior in 2002, which we know from Chanel affected her for 20 years. You're saying you actually provided a living, breathing human example of what James Baldwin was writing about 40 years earlier. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And what's so striking to me is that when I went back and listened to the interview with Chanel, this is 2 years later, and after I had come across Baldwin, who I was not as familiar with, she says the same thing Baldwin's saying. She says,
it had me to second guess my dress attire and to take me out of who Chanel is. It made me dress differently than how I would normally dress. I dressed differently. That wasn't me. From that point on, you would see Chanel in slacks. You would rarely see me in a dress. And people that knew me, some of them that really knew me, they was like, I don't see you in dresses anymore. And I probably made up some skills. Yeah, I don't feel like wearing heels or something like that, something crazy like that. That incident had an effect on me. A long-term change in clothing for the fear of being approached again about my dress attire. How dare they? How dare they?
And so this was, again, Chanel speaking to us and speaking to me when we were kind of reflecting on what had happened to her 20 years earlier. But you can see the close parallel between what Baldwin is talking about and how what happened to Chanel, or what I did to Chanel, exemplified that.
So there you have it, an instance where James Baldwin may have recapitulated in advance some behaviors of yours, and we assume they're not just behaviors of yours. But that interpersonal moment, I mean, are you arguing that it is something we all need to scrutinize ourselves for, or are you suggesting that this is the seedbed of a wide range of racial disparities that occur in society? What's the importance of this for our podcast?
Our podcast is about becoming a healer, and we use that term in a specific way. It's the idea that a physician or other healthcare professional is not just technically doing their job, but that they're truly allies for their patients. They're present. They relate to them with a sense of shared humanity. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that racist ideas, and again, I'm not the first to say this, but I've seen it in myself. Racist ideas not only harm our patients, but we harm ourselves because one of the things, and again, I'm going to quote Baldwin, he says, one cannot deny the humanity of another without diminishing one's own. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself. And so I think that there are messages from this challenge of confronting our racist ideas that are there not just for the benefit of those over whom we have power, and that applies to patients as well as subordinates in the workplace. But it also is critically important for our humanity as well. And so I think that that's why I found it helpful to kind of reflect on the way in which racist ideas have shaped me, not just in the context of what happened with Chanel, but just more broadly as a person and as a physician.
I imagine somebody might say, hey, if we're going to talk about racism, you're two white guys on a podcast, it's kind of navel gazing. Why don't you get a black person to join you on that podcast and kind of work through these issues? Why aren't you being inclusive in the design of this podcast episode?
So I'm thinking of a comment by Toni Morrison who said, leave me out of it. She wrote, white people have a very serious problem and they should start, and they is emphasized here, and they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Leave me out of it. And so, and I think there are several reasons for that. One is it's traumatizing for, if you're black to just be in the middle of a conversation between people who may contribute to some of the things that cause them suffering and pain. Leave me out of it. The other thing I would mention is that Ibram X. Kendi starts, I can't remember which book it is, I think it's How to Be an Anti-Racist. He starts by actually describing the way in which he exhibited anti-black racism, even as a black man who has committed his life and his scholarship to confronting racism. And he does that in his opening chapter, I think in many ways to give us permission. And he makes the point that we have to stop thinking of talking about our having racist ideas as being sort of like something that's going to get us in big trouble, and that's a pejorative. He says, look, we live in a culture that is just awash in racist ideas. They're very much a part of our history, part of the way in which we're trained and educated. And so on any given day, we may say or do things that reflect racist ideas, and on other days we may do things that are anti-racist. And so this reflection is just a natural thing for personal growth, I guess, and professional growth as a physician.
I want to flag about myself that it seems to me entirely possible that I entertain various forms of prejudice when I meet all kinds of different people, including black people, without even knowing it, and very much interested in understanding when that happens and correcting it. But there is this additional step that Kendi is kind of famous for, which raises a lot of discomfort, which is that he kind of speaks about the idea that there's essentially two possibilities here. There's no such thing as a not racist idea, he wrote. There's only racist ideas and anti-racist ideas. That proposition that ideas fall into two categories that are sort of binary, and that I, Stefan Kertes, walking through the world, will either have one or the other, but wouldn't necessarily, it seems to me that it may not capture the full dimensions of how humans perceive each other and how we interact with each other. It sounds a little too simplistic to me. And it's not crucial that we adjudicate the man Kendi or the man Kendi's ideas. The only reason I'm asking about this is it important for understanding how we become better healers as doctors, whether we answer that question?
Yeah. So if I went back to the example with Chanel, when I was advised or told by somebody who had more power over me that we need to do something about the way Chanel dresses, I had some choices and I made the wrong choice. I acted on what I was being told to do because I was a young attending, I was a program director, and I wanted to protect myself. I wanted to be accepted in the power structure. And I don't want to speak for Kendi, but I think what he was saying is that you only had two choices there. You either push back or you go along with it. And there's no middle ground. And I think that, again, this is not a discussion of his work and his ideas, but I think that story exemplifies is a good example of what I think he's talking about. Another example I would give is that When I walk into a room to see a patient, and that patient is poor and Black, for instance, and I mentioned the poor part, not because people are poor because they're Black. There are people who are Black and not poor, and people who are white and poor. But I think there's a strong case to be made that the whole concept of Black and white is a part of a caste system. This is, again, something that comes out in Isabel Wilkerson's work, and that it's basically about power structures that go back to our early founding as a country. But I think that the when I walk into a room and I see a person who is Black and typically poor, certainly at the hospital where I work, one of the hospitals where I work, am I aware of anything that's happening inside me that makes me maybe value that person a little bit less because they don't look like me? Would I be reacting to them differently? Am I going to take them a little less seriously? Am I going to be a little less likely to connect with them or to follow up on those labs or maybe to advocate for them? To me, these are important questions because there's overwhelming evidence from many, many studies that there are huge disparities in healthcare, and that in general, Black patients don't get the same care as white patients. And we all think it's somebody else's problem. Oh, no, I don't do that. I'm not responsible for that. And so I think the point is that if you're saying that to yourself, well, I don't need to be anti-racist here. I'm just not racist. The question is who are you fooling? That the evidence says that you're functioning in a system. Now, you could be that rare exception, isn't? But the point is, look inside and figure that out. Be honest with yourself. And I think that's where I mean, again, I don't want to speak for Kendi, but to me, that's where I sort of feel like there isn't a middle ground, given the evidence of these disparities, which I don't think serious people dispute. And then just to take our whole nation, people who are Black on average in this country only have 12% of the wealth of people who are white. It's not like they have 80% or 70%, they have 12%. So there are unbelievably huge implications of having a skin color in this country on your economic future. They're, sevenfold magnitude. And so again, if we're saying, well, this is not really a problem, I'm not racist, I don't contribute to this. But I think what we're saying is, no, given the evidence, given the disparities, we have to be candid with ourselves that you can only be part of the solution or part of the problem.
I want to cycle through that again with your permission. I work very heavily with people who are homeless or formerly homeless. I see all kinds of inequalities. Plenty of my white patients are in devastating situations. In fact, in some homeless safety net studies, white homeless individuals actually have worse health than Black homeless individuals. And the reason has never been fully worked out, but one of the hints is that when you go to a safety net setting, the average person, on statistical average, given that wealth difference you just described, people who are white wind up falling into homelessness after many more malfunctions in their life. And on statistical average, purely as an average, people who are Black may only be one paycheck away from being homeless. So you often find these situations where there's all kinds of barriers for patients who are Black that are different from the patients who are white. And the question I ask myself as a clinician is, am I asking of myself that I'm doing the maximum to help this person overcome the challenges that our healthcare system is presenting to them? So it may be that I need to start making phone calls with the patient in the room to make sure that that referral goes through and that the patient sees me doing that for them. Or it may be that I need to call somebody that the patient wants me to call on their behalf. Or it may be that I need to acknowledge that some bad things really happened the last time you were here, when you saw so-and-so in the emergency room. And I'm really sorry for that. And I'll work with you to try to remedy that. But that labor that I undertake, I'm not undertaking that labor differently because somebody is Black or white. I'm just saying whatever is the problem that they say is affecting their ability to use our services or that I think might, I have to work my ass off. And working my ass off isn't predicated on their being Black or white. It's just predicated on understanding as particularly as possible what were the challenges they faced. And when I do that, I feel like I'm operating outside the framework of racism or anti-racism. Am I, or am I playing dumb with myself here and conversing with you?
That's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it. And I think the reason I think it's so important is if you actually look at the work of Martin Luther King or the writings of Kendi or the writings of Baldwin, they were actually all saying the same thing. They believed that poor white people are victimized as well. That if you think about, racism is a tool of exploitation. And again, some of you are familiar with the way in which particularly poor whites are sort of neutralized and reminded that, at least you're better than folks who are black. Like there are many ways in which racism has been used as a tool.
Big part of Alabama history, by the way.
Absolutely. And so these civil rights leaders, black leaders, they were onto that. They understood that when MLK was assassinated, he was fighting for sanitation workers. And so I think that you're right on target when you understand that when we walk into a room, we, and again, when I say we, I should be saying me, but I think you and I share a lot in common, which is that we came from fairly privileged backgrounds. We had excellent educations.
Yes.
We were not impoverished. We were white. We really had all of the opportunities you could hope for. I think that when we went through our educational and growth experience, we were taught a lot of things that reinforced our belief that we were sort of just part of a merit-based society and that we got to where we are out of merit. And that can give you a view of the world that in subtle ways, no matter what we say, devalues people who are not as fortunate as we are and sort of says, well, it was our hard work that got us here. And again, this reminds me of a quote.
You have an example. Quote.
Well, I was just thinking, like we consider ourselves liberals, and both of us, at least I consider myself a liberal. I shouldn't speak for you. I'm not sure where you put yourself.
I do. I consider myself a liberal. Yes, right. I'm guilty as charged.
Okay, well, so this is what Baldwin had to say about us. He said, in general, my experience of liberals is that they have all the proper attitudes, but that they have no real convictions. And when the chips are down and you expect them to deliver on what you thought they felt, they somehow are not there. And I've tried to be better than that. But I think his point is well taken. And one of the things I've learned, and again, this came out of my conversation with Chanel, is that you don't know what your blind spots are. We all think that we're not racist, we're not classist. We all have that view of ourselves. Almost nobody doesn't, for the most part, and it's certainly universal among liberals. So I think that's where we have to have a certain humility. And I don't like the word humility because it sounds kind of corny, but yeah. So, for example, again, going back to my conversation with Chanel, realizing that there was something I was completely unaware of about myself that I was doing, that I was perpetuating, that I was causing harm, and was completely unaware of that. And now it seems so obvious 20 years later, 22 years later. And so I have to ask myself, well, what am I doing now that also may be part of the problem rather than part of the solution? And I found that this process of reflecting, contrary to what everyone says, it doesn't make me feel guilty at all. It feels very rich. I feel like I'm growing and I'm gaining insight and about myself. And it also makes me enjoy my work as a doctor, taking care of patients more, as I start to realize that maybe in subtle ways I was judgmental of them. And now I'm not judgmental of them. And when you're not judgmental of somebody, you value them, and therefore you value the encounter more, and therefore you get more joy spending time with them as their doctor.
Do we know that you or me are more judgmental of our Black patients than our white patients?
Well, the point I want to make is, how would we know? And
I don't know.
To me, one of the best tip-offs that racist ideas are not at play is, are you enjoying the relationship? So when I walk into a room with a patient, I sit down, in this case, let's say it's somebody who's both poor and Black. And when you find that you're enjoying the relationship you have with that patient, when I say enjoy, I mean it as a sense of shared humanity. You're in valuing what they're, them in the same way that you would value anyone you care about. You value the way in which they make you feel like you're spending your time well, I guess I would say. When that's happening, I think that's a good sign that racist ideas, classist ideas, any of those things that are floating around out there, are not at play.
They're not getting in the way. So in the ideal situation, I hear a person's story. I want to understand what the heck is going on, the bad and the good. And usually those elements that I hear then wind up being matters we address to make sure that there's successful care of the incipient cancer, the diabetes, the mental health condition, the addiction. That's the ideal. But I still sound like a liberal. And I think you just said that liberals need to be looked at with a great deal of skepticism here. Are we dressing up our basic liberalism as something better than it is?
Again, Baldwin said, and again, this is so interesting. He said, it's not about good and evil. It's about corruption versus love. And it reminded me a little bit of actually an encounter I had just last week in clinic. I was actually staffing urgent care in one of the ERs that I work in. And an older Black man came in. He was, I think, in his 60s. And and again, this was in a VA clinic. And this was a man who travels around the country because he does building demolition. He's kind of a day laborer. And so he doesn't really have a home. He's constantly on the move. And one of the things that he shared is that he often tries to sleep in the vehicles that he's working with during the day. He actually manages some of the demolition vehicles, and he said sometimes he gets kicked out of them, and he stays in a really cheap like boarding house type situation. And because he doesn't really have a home, he also doesn't have a medical home. So he's not signed up with a primary care doctor. And because of that, a lot of his medical issues haven't been addressed. He's got some issues related to BPH that are uncomfortable, things like that. And so he's kind of miserable all the time, but he's not been able to titrate medications appropriately or get plugged in or see a specialist because of this itinerant life he has. And so the resident who came in and presented this patient to me, talked in the way you might expect somebody who is working in an ED, said, look, we checked the post-void residual. There's not a lot of urine in his bladder, so at least he's not obstructing. We checked a UA. It's fine. There's no UTI. So his symptoms are clearly just BPH. So I basically told him, there's nothing we can really do for him here in the ED. And I couldn't really argue with that. I mean, it was a basic, decent workup. But then I went in and I sat down and I started talking to this guy, and this story came out, and I just sort of shared with him what a tough situation it was. And I was expressing my frustration. I didn't have any solutions. Like, given that you're moving around, we can't really set you up with a primary care doctor, so you can't get all that kind of stuff. And he started to reflect, and he said, maybe it really is time for me to settle down. He said, I could collect my Social Security if I stopped working. He said I could actually work up to $27,000 a year, and before I started getting penalized. Like, this is coming from him. And he said, maybe I need to settle down. And he mentioned the city which had once been his home. And, take care of myself. I could start working out again, which is something I wanted to do. And I'm just listening to this guy, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds like a really, really good idea. And then I said, maybe even after you do that for a while, you could hit the road again if you wanted to. And he was just like, well, thank you. And it was so interesting because, first of all, the solutions came from him, not from me. But it was just person to person. I was sharing with him what I was thinking, what I was concerned about, and I was just feeling connected to this guy. And then it allowed him to come up with the answers. And anyway, that to me felt good. And it felt good. It felt real. It didn't feel like, I guess I would say the nonsense that we're talking about, the isms were not present. I was present with him. And so that I certainly would have been less likely to experience that if I had been judgmental in some way, or if I had devalued him in any way.
I have some parallel stories of that nature. They are not all with Black patients or all with white patients, but certainly one that comes to mind where the individual was Black. It was a guy who had a diagnosis that was some sort of mental illness and many hospitalizations for it, and also some criminal justice entanglement, and in fact, many criminal justice entanglements, and was hospitalized in a way that involved both drug use, potential risk of a new arrest, and a mental health crisis. And I'm not saying we figured everything out, but one of the things I heard was that the interruption of his self-care was always tied to identifying a problem in the family that he needed to fix. And I think that there would have been a bit of a temptation to say psychotic mental illness, cocaine, criminality, and let's just say he's Black, and maybe just let that case be there until the psychiatrist took him away or something. And partly because of our own conversation, Saul, I was like, well, so why did you leave the place you were at before? What went on? What was going on there? Why were you reacting in the way that you did? And the guy started talking about, well, so-and-so got in trouble, and I knew I needed to clean up that mess for her, or she would get in worse trouble. So yeah, the coping of the patient was not great. The things they did to clean up other people's messes were often not ideal. But the conversation became much more about why do we sometimes wind up in situations where we want to take care of somebody and we wind up harming ourselves. And that's a very human to human conversation, which arguably all three things could have stood in the way of: color, criminal justice history, drug use. And luckily we got through it. I want to admit or acknowledge here that we still haven't embraced or refuted the idea that a truly liberal and open mind can overcome these issues.
I think that it absolutely can, when that so-called liberal mind is making a good faith effort to look at itself. There's a comedian with SNL.
Kenan
Thompson, yeah. So there's this wonderful line by Kenan Thompson. I think I heard it on Fresh Air, where he talked about the fact that he loved whenever he was doing gigs in the South, like he used to go to these comedy clubs before he was well known, where he'd approach a gas station and there would be like a Confederate flag. He said, I love seeing that because it was just like, okay, thank you. I guess I shouldn't stop there. He said, but he's like, I appreciate the heads up. Like, that's not where I'm going to get gas. He said, but when I'm in the North, I have absolutely no idea because everybody's like smiling and acting friendly. And I have no idea when somebody's going to like do something to harm me, either to my face or behind my back. And so I think the point is that there is this idea that the liberals are like, well, we're not like Birmingham, Alabama. And so that's I think what we're getting at here. And I think so. I don't know. I don't know how any of these people would think about our conversation, other than I hope they would appreciate the fact that we're making an effort. And I think the truth is, neither you nor I know what it's like to be poor and Black in America, or to be in either category, but not in the second. And I think one of the things about being a physician is that it behooves us to be inquisitive about the people whose lives the people we're caring for, and not to make any assumptions about their lives, particularly assumptions that involve judgment. And I think judgmentalism is a default result of any of these isms. And so I think that the example you just gave was where you said to this patient of yours, tell me about what's going on, and you realize that they were actually just trying to be part of a community. They're trying to actually help somebody else out who they thought was worse off than them, and that's really helpful. And to see that reflects that this person is just trying to show caring towards someone else, and in ways that maybe are difficult for them because their problems are so great that they're, and you're seeing the harm that that's doing to them. But anyway, that I think that's what it means to not make assumptions about people, and to be open-minded and non-judgmental.
One of the things that you said to me in prep for this episode is that you felt that you'd been kind of weighed down by historically making assumptions that you later came to shed. And at the risk of embarrassing you, or you embarrassing yourself, I wonder if you feel comfortable sort of talking about where you suddenly discovered you'd been making assumptions all along.
Yeah, it begins as far back as I can remember. If I go back even to grade school and high school, when we learned American history, it was, I don't know what your class was like, but it was about, oh yes, there were these great founding fathers, who were, of course, white, and yeah, they had slaves, which was unfortunate, but you can't judge them in their time. It was a different time, and then of course there was a lot of slavery, and that was bad, but we don't have that anymore, and just that whole way of, first of all, there are a number of things that I come to appreciate about that. One is the degree to which it inherently downplays the extraordinary horror of what happened, and the pervasiveness of what happened, and in so doing, could make you, as a white person today, devalue people who are Black a little bit, right? Because like, hey, slavery happened. Yes, it was terrible, but we're over it, blah, blah, blah. And obviously what is that those people were Black and we're white. And so that process of educating in a way can build racism into your way of thinking without your even being aware of it. And then, of course, the other thing that I remember saying, at least in college, maybe after that, was like, why are you blaming me for racism? I wasn't even born yet. I wasn't even close to born yet. So like, that has nothing to do with me. And again, Baldwin writes about this, the way Americans really, really want to think that like they're not connected to their past. And I remember playing cowboys and Indians growing up. And of course, I always wanted to be a cowboy. They were the good guys. They were the heroes. And now, of course, I understand that they were part of a system of slaughtering Native Americans and eliminating them from the land to the degree possible. And again, that was one of the ways our country just tried to whitewash our past. And so I think at almost every stage, I think about when I was a resident, which was during the O.J. Simpson trial, which was in 1995. It was all I was hearing about on the radio when I drove home every day. It was just like, oh, O.J. Simpson, O.J. Simpson. And what I remember is getting like really caught up in it. This is before social media, but it was kind of like it was almost like a universal event. And whites and Blacks in this country got completely polarized. I'm generalizing here, but a lot of people who are Black felt like, oh, he's innocent. A lot of people who are white were like, how could you even think that he's innocent, right? And I remember thinking that myself. And then years later, again, Toni Morrison actually wrote a book about this. She was like, why did white people even care that much? Like, isn't that a jury's job? Like, why were you even so exercised about this? And would you have cared so much if Nicole Simpson had been Black? Would anyone care? Like, if a Black guy had killed a Black woman, was it? And so all of this stuff, I now look back on it and I realize that. And then, of course, people who are Black knew a lot more about the way the criminal justice system works because they experienced it firsthand and how easy it is for the system not to work as it's supposed to, disproportionately if you're Black. And so I think that as a white person, now looking back on it, I'm sort of thinking to myself, like, what was going on with me? Like, why was I so exercised about it? And so again, I think that if almost every stage in my life, I can look back at ways in which. Oh, here's one that's a little cringy, but I'll mention it. When I finished,
Oh, I want to cringe now.
when I finished my residency, I started working as a faculty member, again at a different place, but near where I was caring for a low-income Black population. And I had this idea that, like, well, okay, I'm not racist, but clearly their culture is dysfunctional. I had just sort of this idea,
Their culture,
the inner city culture is
it.
dysfunctional. And I sort of had this idea of like, oh, is there anything I could do to go in there, kind of, help, make it more functional, right? And again, first of all, there's a sort of white savior notion there, which has a long, very bad history. And then secondly, what I don't think I understood at that point was it wasn't that this was sort of some sort of self-perpetuating culture. This is a group of people who are experiencing a great deal of oppression in the present moment, and who are and that this is not just like some residue. This idea was like it's a residue of the past. Oh yes, they were enslaved for so many years or badly treated, and they still haven't gotten over it. That was like the argument. That was actually the liberal argument that you would often see. And again, and now I understand that itself is a perpetuation of a racist idea that no culture.
Which thing?
Oh, the idea that the problem with Black people in the quote ghetto is that they haven't gotten over their trauma. They just have a dysfunctional culture because they were traumatized in the past. That itself is a racist idea. And rather than asking yourself, is there anything that possibly could be happening right now to people who are poor, low income, and living in urban environments, given what we know about the way in which the economy works, the way in which systemic racism works, that could account for their behavior that isn't just that they're like carrying past traumas, but maybe they're experiencing current traumas. And these were not things that I had begun to think about. I mean, again, I could go on, but I almost sort of feel like at every point there are sort of these insights.
But okay, so I've given you a chance to embarrass yourself, which was the goal here. But you've described a set of kind of inherited notions, ideas that you didn't always interrogate at the time that might have been consequential. And we're not talking about whether Saul was successful in changing society. We're talking about whether they were consequential for you being a doctor who could help people. Is it possible that you could absorb for 20 years or 10 years some racist ideas and maybe still be a very effective doctor?
I think that when you absorb racist ideas, and I believe we all do because they're everywhere, and I think that when we absorb them, it affects everything. It affects the way in which we experience our interactions with other people, and by the way, not just other people who are Black, but each other, because I think to some degree, when you're not seeing the full humanity of any group of people in society, you're diminished in some way. And I think that when you start to more fully realize the humanity of everyone in society, and you start to realize that maybe you hadn't been fully doing that with people because they were poor or they. I talk in my book on Becoming a Healer. I talk about how much trouble I have when somebody smells bad. Like if somebody's homeless and I walk in the room and they smell bad, that would really trigger me. I would just want to kind of get out. And that's a form of dehumanization. It was just a visceral response. But I think that when I do that, first of all, I can't be as effective a physician because, for example, the conversation that I just described with that patient, which allowed him to discover that maybe it was time for him to retire and start taking his Social Security, that kind of conversation would be much less likely to happen if I just was trying to get a bunch of tasks done, because I think you go into this efficient task completer mindset where you're kind of staring at the computer like, what do I need to do to finish up this visit? Like, I just need to get in some orders, need to cover these bases, whatever, put in a couple consults, and then we can move on. Which is sort of like what the resident had done, which was I checked the post-void residual, I checked the UA and so forth, and like there's really nothing more we can do. That's sort of the efficient task completer mindset. Is that bad doctoring? In my opinion, it leaves a lot to be desired. But it makes for good notes, and you can bill at a level 4 or a level 3 or whatever. In other words, but to me,
you get more money.
Yeah, exactly. But to me, it's lacking, and I also think that it contributes to burnout because it's soul sucking. The kind of relationship you're having with patients, with this sort of like efficient task completer approach, is eventually it just becomes you can't go through a day, you can't go through 8 hours and just not be connecting with the people who are coming into your office on a daily basis, and not eventually just start to lose your sense of joy in your work.
So, as a doctor, in any situation where there's something that initially makes me uncomfortable, or I feel distant or remote or put off or at odds with the person I'm supposed to take care of, there's a fork in the road. And one fork is, I got to get through this visit so I can get to the next one because there's too many to do today. We got to get through rounds. The team is waiting for me. And so sometimes that's the fork I take. It inevitably does happen because you might have to see 10 patients in a, 75-minute rounding session. You're just not going to be able to dive into everything. And so sometimes what happens is efficient task completion. But what I long for and what I do get to do enough that I feel fulfilled, as I said, I ask myself, I wonder if there's something about this person I could really admire if I just got to know it. I wonder if there's something about this person's life experience that I could find an echo of in my own life experience if I just got a chance to have a nice conversation. And there's a certain amount of, I see it as a bit of a challenge. Like, I might come from a very different place. I might not have been prepared to meet you today, but if I could find something that's interesting about your life and your situation that I can connect to mine, it'll be a really cool day. And so there's actually some enjoyment for me, which I think affirms your point about avoiding soul-sucking forms of medical work when you can actually form a connection. And sometimes that does involve setting aside preconceptions about the person in front of me. So I affirm what you say. Now I want to offer what might be more of a social critique. The word you've used a lot is racism. And there is a vibrant and sometimes angry social discourse about the use of the word racism as the best way to encompass disparities in life experience, disparities in opportunity, disparities in health that are that strike us as concerning and unfair. And the critique that I heard John McWhorter make in a lecture at Bard College is something like this.
For our listeners, I know he's a black
linguist,
conservative scholar. Yeah, somewhat.
He would say he's a liberal, but a contrarian liberal scholar who writes for the New York Times and probably annoys as many people as he pleases. Yeah. Sometimes the word racism pulls out of you an emotional reaction because you start to react to that as if it is an immediate grab you by the gonads sort of expression. And it gets in the way of asking, what is the problem we need to fix now in order to address a social problem? So he gives an example of a school. It's a school where he says, hypothetically, there's more Black and brown kids. It used to be good in the 50s. It's not good now. When it got bad, actually, there was racism because there was white flight in 1963. And this happened in Birmingham all the time, by the way. And yes, there was actual racism that played a key role in what denuded those schools of a community and of resources. So yes, at the inception point, there was racism. But today, right now, in that school, there's a set of teaching techniques, qualifications to work there, standards for work, ways of doing business that need to be addressed here and now. And the racism part of it, sometimes that word itself gets in the way of addressing what I need to do right here, right now for this school. And maybe gets in the way of what I need to do right here, right now for us as doctors, for this patient. So is the word racism sometimes a distraction? And I'm really trying to channel John McWhorter here.
I mean, I think for the sake of our discussion, I'm interested in what's happening, the changes that are happening inside me. So I don't have to talk, I mean, other than the fact of having this conversation, this isn't a situation of me bringing up any words with anybody. This is just a process of self-discovery and self-learning. So the question is, do I want to ask myself whether racist ideas have influenced me in an interaction with somebody? And I also want to sort of say that if I speak honestly, it's not just about racist ideas. It's also, am I bringing in any type of, I could say propaganda, things that have influenced me, whether it's the way in which I look at somebody because of their gender or their race or their age, or because, they're very poor and they look bad, they smell bad or whatever. Just that tendency to recognize that I have been affected by the many decades at this point, quite a few decades I've been on this planet in this country with a number of ideas. And by the way, Kendi uses the term racist ideas, which I like for a number of reasons, as opposed to just using the word racism. He thinks it's more useful to talk about racist ideas. And I find it more helpful to do that. There are these things floating around that affect us, that think about us. And again, for me, it's twofold. It's that when I walk into a room, if I'm trying to connect with that person and I'm having trouble, I have to sort of reflect on what's going on or why that may be. When you talked about how you try to look for something that you admire in each patient. And
Yes.
I would put it a little differently. For me, it's just looking for connection. And in that connection, I begin to feel some attachment to them. They don't have to, it's not so, I'm not sure admiration would come along. So for instance, take the example of this man who, in talking with me, started to say that maybe it's time to retire, to collect his Social Security, to stop running from place to place and doing building demolition. To me, what was joyous about that was just seeing somebody in my presence, because of just me asking some questions and being a human being with him, which maybe he hadn't had a lot of opportunity to do, to just start to think about and talk about things that could transform his life. This is a guy who for years has been neglecting himself, just trying to make a buck every day. And all of a sudden he's saying, gosh, maybe it's time for me to do things very differently. And in a way that actually looked like it could be wonderfully positive for him. And so just seeing that happen in front of me as a result of my just walking in there as a fellow human being and saying, gosh, I wish there was more we could do for you, but this is the situation. That felt great. And does that mean I admired him? In a small way, it did. I admired seeing this person in front of a relative stranger, which is me, starting to open up and articulate things about himself that maybe he had been thinking about but hadn't fully articulated, that would involve major change. And I have to say I admired that. I admired the fact that he was, willing to do that in front of me. So it wasn't like
that
a pony
that wasn't your task of the day, though, to find something to admire.
No. And admire is not the word I would choose. But yes, there was a sense of wonder at seeing that happen in my presence.
No, I want to ask you specifically, you put up the idea that you like actually the word racist ideas better than racism. I want to give you a chance to clarify what the difference between those two things is, and then we'll see if that helps us think about how to do
and again, I'm going back to Kendi in this case, who introduced it. And in a book that he wrote called Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, he spends hundreds of pages talking about how racist ideas emerged as a way of justifying enslavement of a group of people for economic purposes. In other words, it wasn't that racist ideas led to enslavement. It was that racist ideas were created to justify enslavement, the brutal repression of a group of people. And actually, he talks about it as having two components. He said they're the propagators of racist ideas, which are the people in power who benefit from creating an environment in which people receive racist ideas, and which is the majority of people. And once you internalize racist ideas, you no longer question the status quo. So you start to say, well, okay, yes, of course these people are enslaved, but that's because they're inferior. So he talks about how racist ideas enable power structures to preserve themselves, to be retained. And so I think that the term racist ideas is actually more accurate. Now, racist ideas can lead us to behave in racist ways, but I think he's got the mechanics right in the way at least it makes sense to me from a historical perspective. And I think the point he's also making is that it's not that useful to just say, oh, you're a racist, because then the implication is that, oh, other people are not racist. And he's like, that's just not framing the world. It's letting too many people off the hook. It's like, oh, I'm not a racist. So he's like, no, that's not actually how it works. The way it really works is that these racist ideas are deeply embedded in our economic and social structure, and that to a varying degrees, we are affected by them, and it leads us to behave in ways that are perhaps racist in some settings and perhaps anti-racist, as he would say, in other settings. So I find that the mechanics of the way he describes it makes sense to me intuitively. It fits. But I also find it useful in that it prevents me from having to say, oh, I'm a racist or I'm not a racist. Because if I say I'm a racist, that's an incredible indictment of myself. If I say I'm not a racist, I don't think that's honest. I think the language he gives me makes sense and works for me in trying to understand how I'm a product of my past and my present.
Let me acknowledge that if someone says to me the type of liberal I am, Stefan, at various times your mind is burdened down by ideas you haven't examined. They get in the way of your relationships. I'm likely vulnerable to sometimes imposing those on others until I interrogate them or until I get feedback from other people. I need to interrogate. I need to ask that question. To me, that's an easy assumption to make about myself. It's entirely consistent with who I've always been to say that. And I don't think many people would take offense to that. On the other hand, at this moment in time, a lot of people do take offense to the idea, the claim that we all are circulating or recirculating racist ideas. And one of the challenges is that it's hard to empirically test. Or if I say, well, I'm not, the person who says I'm not recirculating a racist idea, they're giving, in the world of this conversation in the society at large, the person will say, no, that's a sure sign that you are. You see, as soon as you deny it, that's a sign that you must be in it, which is not a very enjoyable way to have a conversation. This is a general argument sometimes that pops up against Kendi in particular, is that to what extent are we just talking about an article of faith? I'm saying Stefan Kirte's article of faith, I have biases. I love learning about them and trying to work around them and figure out what to do with them. That's not a problem for me, but in society at large, somehow saying everybody has these, and particularly when it comes to race, it's very provocative and it's not always demonstrable. It's hard to prove in various moments. You can find examples. I could give you an example. A survey of medical students found more believed that Black people were somehow not subject to feeling pain to the same extent as white people. That was a stunning survey. That didn't mean every medical student felt that way. That was empiric support for the notion that in one domain, under some people, there were racist assumptions. But if you say we're all at all times absorbed in racist ideas, we're inadvertently perpetuating them, it becomes very hard to interrogate. And it's certainly very provocative. It's excited a lot of pushback from Black scholars, I've noticed, not just from white ones.
So my response to that is to go back to this stunning disparity, which is that, as I said, the color of your skin has a 7-fold effect on your average wealth. That's stunning. And so I think the burden of proof falls extremely heavily on people who don't think we live in a racist society to explain that one, because it's just staggering, right? It's not like a small difference; it's many-fold difference. And so the question then becomes, if you think you're like, I don't mean you, Stefan, if a person thinks I'm that rare exception, I'm just not, like, I understand that we must live in a society that is extremely racist if there's a 7-fold difference between wealth just because of skin color, but it's not me. It might be a lot of other people, but it's not me. I think it's possible that you are that extraordinarily rare exception, but it's just not likely. What Kendi and others will say is it's precisely the people who say I'm the exception. It's not me, or I'm not racist. That's why he doesn't really buy into this dichotomous thing. There are a small number of bad apples and everybody else is just fine. I think what he's saying is it's just not how society works. If you look at the history of how racism and, as Wilkerson would say, a caste system emerged out of economic oppression. And there's probably no greater form of economic oppression than enslavement. But if you look, I think, with what I would call open eyes at the historical context for racism in this country, and then you look at the economic chasm, you would have to say it's been very successful. Like the racist ideas have been incredibly successful at creating a huge economic disparities between people based on their skin color. So I guess that's how I would challenge somebody who would say it's just not me.
I mean, it's tricky because any historical analysis is hard, right?
I'm not talking about historical analysis. The sevenfold difference is today.
I got it. But I guess I'll just go back to this notion that you could have had something that is meaningfully and importantly best understood as an expression of racial antagonism and animus in 1850 and in 1950 and in 1960. And then the events that unfold from there may still embed some of that history. You could address problems in the present, acknowledging a historic vector, without saying it all comes down to that historic vector. And as a doctor, in a weird way, that's often where we're at. We're working with the person in front of us now, and we want to shed our biases and we want to be open, but we don't necessarily have to interrogate every past assumption we made 20 years ago in order to be effective for the person in front of us, right?
Well, even if you were blind to history, you're still stuck with the reality of the present, which is this extraordinary wealth gap. And the other thing I think that's important to point out here is that it's not just race. We know that there are enormous inequities in our country, even among people who are white, and there's a lot less mobility, a lot less social mobility, and it's much harder to move from the bottom up than people believe it is. There's this myth of the American dream, and yet, economists will tell you that it's pretty tough. And I'm talking about people who are white now as well. And actually, again, MLK understood that. James Baldwin understood that. They understood that this wasn't just about racism. This is about economic oppression, and racism is being a very powerful tool of it, but not the only tool. And so I think that it's disproportionately effective and powerful. And again, that's borne out by the economics. This gap of 7-fold takes into account putting poor whites in the same bucket as rich whites. So the
Yes.
point is that it's disproportionate. But the role of a physician, I think, is to not be naive and clueless and closed-minded about the world they live in and the world they're a product of and the world that their patients come from. If we blind ourselves to all that and walk in and just say, I'm just here to do my job, and not going to think about any of the stuff that's going on in the world that shaped me, that shaped these patients, then I think we're doing our patients a disservice. But I also think we're doing ourselves in the relationship with those patients a disservice, because the reality is that again, I should speak for myself. I've learned that I am chock full of these racist ideas, and that I've had to work very hard, and I do work very hard and class ideas as well. I've worked very hard to try to understand them, and that to the extent I'm successful, I think I find more joy in my work, and I think I'm more useful as a physician. And if I didn't do that, I think I would be the worse for it. I'd be more likely to burn out. I'd be less likely to have meaningful connection with my patients. And also, I think it would make me less effective. Now, I probably have a lot more growing to do. And I don't know, as I said, it's hard to know what you don't know about yourself. But I think that growth process is very much at the center of my book on becoming a healer, and just sort of saying that the way we're trained as physicians is very much focused on efficient task completion. And we talk about all this stuff, but do we really wrestle with the way in which we are part of those power structures and affected by them over the course of our journey into medicine?
Several of those power structures came up in the prior episodes, and it probably is worth acknowledging that even if not every single one of those episodes was focused directly on race, they included the situations where we as doctors wind up inadvertently exceeding to harm or continuing a harm with patients. We talked about drug testing and reporting at the time of birth, which I can understand some situations where someone might argue for that, but broadly speaking, our guest pointed out the number of ways in which our medical response is unhelpful. We've talked in the past about a fair number of issues related to prescription opioids, because that's a topic of mine. And of course, that's another area where, strangely, we've had a hard time understanding when opioids might be needed, particularly for patients who are Black. And then it turns out there's a significant literature showing a disproportionate tendency to cut opioids off in patients who are Black compared to those who are white, which at least requires some interrogation as to what that's about. We've had several episodes of that nature. So I think as a clinical matter, at a minimum, we can say we have to be asking of ourselves, what are we doing here at this moment? And is it really for the patient's benefit, or are we doing something by habit without interrogating what it is? Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. I think you've really you've given some very practical examples and ones that we've discussed recently, and how is it that, and again, we discussed this in one of the early episodes, that doctors walk into the ICU and see a patient who's Black, sedated, intubated, paralyzed, and in shackles, like tied to the bed. How does that not set off an, oh my God? Well, clearly it somehow got normalized, and that person's walking in there and just not seeing the problem. Yes, I think that a lot of themes that we visited amplify why I agree with you. And I think that this is an important thing for us to be looking into ourselves about.
As we come toward the close here, I think that we should take one step back and talk about the personal feelings and risks that we may feel we've taken, and even in doing this episode, and also invite feedback from others. I think the word racism is highly intense. It brings up many, many reactions to people. So in making an episode specifically where we're both speaking about ourselves, me sometimes challenging you or even sounding like, arguably a little bit conservative skeptic, or you talking about your own racist ideas, we may be seen in a way that we'd rather not be seen in having this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think you make an important point, one that obviously hasn't escaped me. When we did the episode with Chanel, and basically I talked about this incident in which I had behaved in a way that was racist towards her, and that caused significant harm, and then she basically agreed with me.
Yeah, she did,
and took it even further. I recognized I was taking some risk in doing that and putting it out there to anyone who wanted to listen to it. And yet it felt right. Felt like that maybe others could benefit in some way from my talking about my own role in perpetuating oppression or harm to a colleague. And then so similarly today, I feel and I hope that by talking about my own journey, which has been both positive, but I think still will reflect that I am a product of my culture, that hopefully that having this sort of disclosure will be helpful to others as well, to others who are, again, predominantly, I'm thinking of my white colleagues when I say that.
I think by the same token, I would say one of my jobs on the podcast has been to act as a foil and to
Yes.
push back a little bit. And in doing that, I spent a lot of time listening to people who I felt would provide a critical voice against the kinds of concepts I imagined you would say.
Yeah. And for our listeners, at least for those who have not listened to a lot of episodes, Stefan does play the foil. That's what he does. So you're not necessarily hearing 100% what Stefan is thinking, but he likes to provoke just because what he's trying to do, I think, is reflect what he thinks some listeners might be thinking. And I think that's part of what a good interviewer does. So thank you, Stefan.
Thank you, Saul.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.